Clara Mims had spent years perfecting her con, and she had become disturbingly good at it. To the untrained eye, she looked every bit the part of an authoritative HOA officer, dressed in a crisp polo shirt with a cheap, laminated badge clipped to her chest and a clipboard filled with official-looking documents. She had a routine, a script, and most importantly, a firm, unwavering presence that made people believe she was legitimate. She always targeted the vulnerable. Elderly residents were her preferred victims, as they were less likely to question her authority and more likely to pay her fake fines without argument. Clara had developed a keen sense for spotting easy marks, the ones who looked worried when they saw her coming, who immediately reached for their wallets the moment she mentioned a fine. Her method was simple. She would stroll through the quiet, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, looking for anything she could turn into a violation. A trash bin left at the curb a little too long. A mailbox that needed a fresh coat of paint. A car parked in the same spot for more than a day. She'd jot down the homeowner's address, then march up to their door with her citation book in hand. "Ma'am, I'm with the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association," she would say, always using the same confident, no-nonsense tone. "You've been cited for failing to comply with our neighborhood regulations. This fine must be paid within 48 hours, or further action will be taken." She never got specific about what that further action was. That was intentional. Letting their imaginations run wild was more effective than any direct threat. Most people, especially the elderly, didn't argue. They took one look at the official-looking ticket, nodded solemnly, and shuffled back inside to fetch their checkbooks or wallets. Clara always insisted on cash payments, under the excuse that it was faster and easier to process. In reality, it left no paper trail, making it impossible for anyone to prove they had ever paid her at all. Her scam had gone undetected for years, largely because her victims were too embarrassed or intimidated to report her. She was careful never to target the same house too often and always rotated through different sections of the neighborhood. If anyone ever grew suspicious, she would disappear for a few months, letting things cool down before resuming her scheme. And it had worked. Until today. Today, Clara made the worst mistake of her fraudulent career. She knocked on the wrong door and tried to scam the wrong person. That person was Jessica Simmons. And Jessica was not like Clara's previous victims. Jessica Simmons had spent 25 years working for the FBI, specializing in fraud cases, undercover operations, and criminal interrogations. She had chased down con artists, infiltrated organized crime rings, and taken down syndicates that had been operational for decades. She knew every trick in the book, every tale of a liar, every scam in existence. And she could smell one from a mile away. Jessica had been enjoying a quiet afternoon. She had just finished mowing her front lawn, her hand still gripping the handle of the mower, when she spotted Clara approaching. She immediately took in the woman's attire, her clipboard, the fake badge. Her trained eye caught every inconsistency: no official HOA branding, no proper documentation, a badge that looked like it had been printed at a local office supply store. She knew exactly what was happening before a single word was spoken. Clara stopped at the edge of Jessica's driveway and cleared her throat, adopting her well-practiced authoritative tone. "Ma'am, you've been parked in your driveway for more than 48 hours. That's a violation of the HOA's regulations." She handed Jessica a ticket with a printed fine of $150. "This must be paid in cash within 48 hours to avoid further action." Jessica took the ticket, glancing over it with an amused smirk. Most people would have panicked, but she simply raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" she said casually. Clara mistook Jessica's calm demeanor for compliance. "Yes, ma'am," she continued, nodding sternly. "The HOA has strict policies regarding vehicle storage. If you fail to pay, legal proceedings may be initiated." Jessica suppressed a chuckle. This woman had no idea who she was dealing with. Without hesitation, she reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She tapped the screen, bringing the device up to her ear as though answering a call. but in reality, she had just dialed 911. She spoke casually into the phone, pretending to have a normal conversation. "Yeah, I'll be right there," she said smoothly. "Just dealing with something real quick." She ended the fake call and looked Clara straight in the eye, her smirk widening. "Now," she said, folding her arms, "why don't we talk about this violation?" Clara stiffened slightly, though she quickly tried to recover. "There's nothing to talk about, ma'am. The fine is valid, and payment is required." Jessica took a slow step forward, lowering her voice to a firm, controlled tone. "You know, I've dealt with con artists my entire career. You remind me of a lot of them." Clara blinked. "Excuse me?" Jessica tilted her head slightly. "You see, real HOA officers don't demand cash payments. They don't hand out citations with no official documentation. And they certainly don't operate in a neighborhood that doesn't even have an HOA." Clara's eyes widened for the briefest moment, a flash of panic that she quickly tried to suppress. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice tightening. "I have full authority to issue these citations." Jessica smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you won't mind waiting a few minutes?" Clara frowned. "For what?" Jessica casually pointed down the street. Clara turned, and her stomach dropped. A police cruiser was approaching. Panic flickered across her face, but she tried to mask it. Now, let's not make a big deal out of this," she said, laughing nervously. "Maybe there was a mistake." Jessica stepped forward, her expression turning ice cold. "Yeah," she said. "You made a big one today." Clara took a shaky step back, her confidence evaporating as the police car rolled to a stop in front of them. Her scam had finally come to an end. Clara Mims had talked her way out of countless situations before, but this was different. The confidence she once carried was slipping fast as the police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Her mind raced for an escape, an excuse, anything that would get her out of this situation. But Jessica Simmons wasn't backing down. The driver's side door of the police car swung open, and Officer Raymond Carter stepped out. He was a stocky man with years of experience on the force, and his sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation. His gaze flickered to Jessica, then to Clara, and finally to the fake citation still clutched in Jessica's hand. "Afternoon, ladies," Officer Carter said, adjusting his belt. "We got a call about a suspicious individual issuing fraudulent fines in the neighborhood." His eyes landed on Clara. "I'm guessing that might be you." Clara straightened up, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "Officer, I don't know what this woman told you, but I work for the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. I'm just doing my job." She gestured toward Jessica's driveway. "She's been in violation of the 48-hour parking rule, and I was issuing a routine fine." Jessica crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. She let Clara dig her own grave. Officer Carter's expression remained neutral, but there was an edge to his tone when he said, "Oak Ridge doesn't have a homeowners association." Clara's mouth opened slightly, her face paling. "That's not true," she blurted out. "I've been enforcing the rules here for years. I have every right." Jessica cut her off, her voice laced with amusement. "You've been running a scam for years," she corrected. "I bet if we check, we'll find dozens of residents who've paid you under false pretenses. And I'd wager you don't have a single legitimate document to back up your so-called authority." Clara shot her a glare, but she had no response. She was cornered, and she knew it. Officer Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." Clara hesitated, then reluctantly reached into her pocket, pulling out a worn-out ID card that claimed she was a representative of the Oak Ridge HOA. It took Officer Carter all of 2 seconds to determine it was fake. He sighed, flipping it over in his hands. "Well, this is definitely interesting," he muttered. Then he turned back to Clara. You got any official paperwork for this so-called HOA? I don't have it on me, Clara stammered. That's convenient, Jessica remarked dryly. Clara's face twisted with frustration. This is ridiculous. I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood in order. Officer Carter's expression hardened. No, what you're doing is fraud and extortion. The weight of the situation was finally crashing down on Clara. Her breath grew uneven, and her hands fidgeted. She glanced around as if looking for an escape route, but Jessica had positioned herself strategically, cutting off any easy retreat. You can cooperate now, or we can take a trip down to the station, Officer Carter continued. Your call. Clara clenched her jaw. I want a lawyer. Jessica smirked. That's probably the first smart thing you've said today. Officer Carter nodded to his partner, who had stepped out of the car. Cuff her. The moment the cold metal handcuffs locked around her wrists, Clara knew, it was over. The news of Clara Mim's arrest spread like wildfire through Oak Ridge. Jessica watched from her porch as the police car drove away, shaking her head in disbelief. It wasn't often that scams like this got exposed so publicly, and she had no doubt that the neighborhood would be buzzing about it for weeks. Not long after, several neighbors began gathering in small clusters, murmuring about what had happened. Some looked shocked, others angry. A few elderly residents even appeared relieved. It didn't take long for one of them, an older man named Mr. Holloway, to approach Jessica with a wary expression. Is it true? He asked. She was a fraud this whole time. Jessica nodded. Afraid so. Mr. Holloway's hands trembled slightly as he exhaled. I've paid her over $1,000 in fines these past few years. His voice was laced with frustration and shame. I thought I had no choice. Another neighbor, a woman named Linda Brooks, stepped forward. Same here. She told me my fence was in violation of HOA standards and that I needed to pay a compliance fee. I gave her $500. She shook her head. I can't believe I fell for it. Jessica's expression softened. You're not alone. Scammers thrive on fear and authority. She was banking on you being too scared or too confused to question her. Linda folded her arms. Well, what happens now? Will we get our money back? That depends, Jessica admitted. The police will investigate. If they find enough evidence, they'll press charges. And if she's been depositing the money into a traceable account, there's a chance you could recover some of it. Mr. Holloway sighed. It's not just about the money. She made us feel like criminals in our own homes. Jessica nodded. She understood all too well how manipulative con artists operated. The important thing is that she won't be doing it anymore. As the sun began to set, more people came forward with their own stories. One by one, they recounted how Clara had bullied them into paying fines for non-existent violations. It became clear that her scam had been much bigger than anyone had realized. By the time Jessica finally stepped back inside her house, she knew this was far from over. Clara might have been caught, but now came the long process of justice, filing reports, gathering evidence, and making sure no one else fell for a similar scheme in the future. She poured herself a glass of water, shaking her head with a chuckle. Retirement was supposed to be peaceful. But for Jessica Simmons, trouble always had a way of finding her. Clara Mim sat in the dimly lit interrogation room of the local police station, her hands still cuffed, her mind racing for a way out. She had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. She knew she couldn't talk her way out this time, her usual tricks wouldn't work with the law breathing down her neck. Across from her, Officer Carter and a detective named Lisa Monroe flipped through a thick folder of complaints that had already started pouring in from the neighborhood. Reports of fraudulent fines, intimidation, and outright theft. Clara had no idea how deep she was in until Monroe set down the stack of papers with a heavy thud. Clara, Monroe began, her voice calm but firm, you've been running this scam for years. We've got over 20 people already willing to testify. You can either cooperate and make this easier on yourself, or we can let the judge throw the book at you. Clara scoffed, trying to keep up the act. You don't have anything solid. Monroe smirked. Actually, we do. We pulled surveillance footage from multiple homes showing you issuing these fake citations. One of them caught you taking cash directly from a victim. We also got a search warrant for your house. Guess what we found? Clara's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Boxes of fake citations, a list of repeat customers, and a stash of over $10,000 in cash. Monroe leaned in slightly. So, let's not waste each other's time. You're done. The only thing left to decide is how hard you want to make this on yourself. Clara slumped back in her chair, exhaling sharply. She knew when she was beaten. What do you want? She muttered. Monroe slid a legal pad toward her. Names of everyone you scammed, bank details if you deposited anything, and any accomplices, if you had any. Clara hesitated for a long moment before she picked up the pen. It wasn't about doing the right thing, it was about damage control. If she gave them enough, maybe she could cut a deal. Back in the neighborhood, news of her arrest had ignited a wave of relief and frustration. The homeowners gathered at a town hall meeting organized by the local authorities. Jessica attended and made a speech, and after she spoke everybody realized that finally the neighborhood would be safe from these horrors from happening ever again.